Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this video is about how to create a project with a PHP backend. I'm not going to talk about how to make the application, but how to deploy the application with a React front end. There's a couple different ways of doing it, but we're going to walk through a way. But there's a couple pieces of software you need before you do that. You're going to need Composer, okay? And you need Node. Okay, so Node is for JavaScript. So Node is a JavaScript server software which comes with a package manager called npm, the Node Package Manager. Composer is a package manager for the language PHP. Now, what's a package manager? Now, in any programming language, there are a lot of libraries, a lot of libraries you can pull from to add functionality to your program that people have already made. So a package manager allows you to be able to bring in those packages, those libraries with ease, and allows you to kind of keep track of them and make it better, much more easier to share what did you use to make your program. Once upon a time, there was no package managers, and it was just really hard to be like, hey, my program uses this and this libraries. And every time you sent the program to somebody, you had to send it with all of the libraries, so it would be this huge file. But now, with Node and npm, when you send someone your Node project, you only need to send them a file called package.json that lists all your dependencies, and they can just hit install, and it installs all those dependencies. With Composer, same thing. It has a composer.json file that lists all your dependencies, and you would just type in composer install, and it'll install all those dependencies. Node always stores those dependencies in a Node modules folder. Composer stores all those things in a vendor folder, but they pretty much work the same way for two different languages. And just a little background on PHP, because especially if you aren't too familiar with PHP, just to learn a little bit of the history, because a lot of times you'll hear people slam PHP, because what they're slamming is old PHP and the old way PHP used to do things back in PHP 3, which had a lot of security holes, wasn't the fastest thing in the world, but it was really kind of like the only game in town at the time, especially if you were a medium to small business. But over the years, starting with PHP 5, a lot of new security features have been included, and now into 2019, they introduced PHP 7, and I think we're at 7.4 now, and where now it's faster than working in Python and Ruby to work with PHP. So PHP has already got a huge market share of the market, and it was losing market share due to the speed, but now that's no longer an issue. So it's like the advantages of switching over languages are now less, so you'd anticipate that PHP would keep its market share going forward. Not just that, but also newer frameworks that have basically created a ease of use. So before you had PHP frameworks like Symfony, CodeIgniter, that made it easier to do web applications. But they were competing against Ruby on Rails in Ruby and Django in Python. But recently, in the last several years, a framework by the name of Laravel has really given Rails and Django a run for money for having a really robust, very all best practices built-in type framework. And if you ever work with Laravel, you'll find that it actually makes working with PHP and creating a web application and backend really, really easy. Okay, so just a little background on PHP. Node, its main framework for backend work would be Express, Koa, Adonis, Full.ts. It has a whole bunch. But again, main thing you do is you need these two pieces of software. Okay, now once you have those installed on your computer, okay, what you're going to want to do is take your project. We're going to start off by breaking your project down into two folders. So let me go to where I have mine. Okay, so we'll go down to unit projects. So I have broken down our project into two folders. So one, see here, Savvy Hotspots PHP, which is going to be the PHP API we're going to use to interact with the database, take data in and out of the database. And then we have Savannah Hotspots, which is the actual React front-end piece that the users will see. Now we're going to separate them into two folders because they're going to be two separate Git repositories and two separate deployments. So let's take a look inside the PHP folder. So the PHP project, again, this is the Git repository here. So there's the .git folder. Okay, the main things you need for the purposes of Heroku is you need a composer.json file. Okay, so again, that's just your dependency file for, and how do you make that? You just go into that folder. Let me just wait for this to open up. Come on, console. Okay, and you would just type in you would just type in composer init. Okay, kind of like in npm for Node, you would type in npm init, you would type in composer init. They work pretty much the same way. It is very particular about what answers you give and the questions it's going to ask you when you do that. So you may want to Google like exactly how you're supposed to respond to the answers. But the idea is that all you really care about is a composer.json file. If you're not using any kind of libraries, you're not using Laravel, you're not using Symfony, you're just a dependency-less project, then you really just need this file there, because Heroku, when you upload your project to Heroku, it's going to look inside the root folder of your project to find a dependency manager file. So, and that's how it tells what kind of language environment to spin up. So whether it should spin up a PHP environment, whether it should spin up a Node environment, whether it should spin up a Ruby environment, Python environment, Go environment, it looks for that. It has to look for something to trigger it, and it's looking for that composer.json. The other file we have here is the proc file. So this has no extension, and it just has this, and this basically says run a web server. This just tells it to use Apache, this middle part, and the slash just means that serve it from your root folder. So basically, this is your root folder, basically where that Git repository starts. So it's saying, hey, when you serve it, your URL is going to go there. So this is why, just as a test to make sure that everything's working, I always put an index.php here that says hello world, because that way I know when I upload it, if everything went right, and I go to the URL that Heroku gives me, I should see hello world. Okay. Now notice I have my API in this API folder. So technically the URL to get to that once I've uploaded it would be heroku.com/API. And then in the way Apache works, the web server, it's going to look in that folder. So it's going to go to /API. It's going to look in that folder. It's going to look for one of two things, either an index.php or a .htaccess file. And if it sees the .htaccess file, that's going to override the index.php. So it's going to look in there to see, hey, is there something that would handle the particular URL you typed in? Okay, so for my API, this only handles if the person types in, you know, API/comments. So basically like heroku.com/API/comments, and then the .htaccess folder kicks in, or file kicks in. So I put an index.php in there too, just in case. So if I type in just /API, it says hello world, then I know that folder is working. This helps you figure out whether it's working or not. Cool, and then that's just that. The rest is just your project, so the rest you would just tinker around with it as you do that. Okay, so but if you're interacting with the database, which you would be if you are building an API, more than likely, Heroku has a built-in Postgres service, so you can actually have them host your database, and you can get it for free for a very limited database, up to I think 10,000 records, and but you want to set that up. Okay, so when in your Heroku account, what you do is you would look for the project that, well, we'll just use this one. Okay, you would look for the project that you plan on using the database for. You would click on resources. Okay, and then you start typing in Postgres, and there you'll see Heroku Postgres. You'll click on that, it'll add the database to your profile, and then you'll see the database over here. You can click on that, it'll take you to another screen where you can then go to settings, and under credentials you'll find all the information about your database. You won't really need that for PHP. All you really want in there is your CLI command. It'll give you the command so that way you can connect to the database from your terminal, so that way you could run SQL commands to create your tables, add data, that kind of stuff. So that way you can set up some basic data for testing. And that's that, okay? So you would do that there. So then you would deploy it. So like here I have it deployed. So again, if I just type in this, it's just going to go to the root folder. I have not, so that's why I put the index.php there, so that way when you go to that, it's loading. It's going to say hello world. So we're going to let it say hello world. It's loading. It's loading. There we go. Hello world. Okay. Now if I type in /API, it goes one folder deep to the API folder. The .htaccess file says nothing for handling this particular route, so it's going to default to looking for an index.php, which I put in there. So it says hello world again. And now if I do API/comments that the .htaccess file is prepared for, it's going to return me this. Now if I were to just add something else, like let's say instead of /API, do /cheese, I don't have a cheese folder. So it's going to get confused. And it's going to say not found. Okay? Because that folder doesn't exist. So if it says not found, that means it just doesn't find it. But what if I go somewhere where there is something? Like for example, in my API folder, there is a controllers folder. Now the thing is that my controllers folder doesn't have an index.php, and the .htaccess says nothing about it. So in that case, it's going to be like, wait, Apache can show you the contents of the folder, but it by default says it should not show you the contents inside the folder, the actual individual files. So it's going to say forbidden. Forbidden, yes. So that means, hey, yes, I have this folder here, but I'm not allowed to show it to you. Okay, so just so that way you can tell what errors mean what. So it doesn't mean something went wrong. It just means you're just trying to look inside of a folder, and it doesn't have an index.php or a .htaccess command that says how to handle that specific route. Cool. Now there's a third thing you can see. You can see like a 500 error. So it'll say like, there was a server error. That would just means there's something wrong with your code. So it found it was able to handle your route. It began to run the code, but something went wrong. Okay, and how do you work from there? Well, you'd go to your folder in your terminal where you have your project that you connected to Heroku, and then you would type in Heroku logs. Okay, you would type in Heroku logs. And how do you upload to Heroku? Just as a go full circle, it should be here on the main page if not in the settings. Access. Let's go here. Maybe it's in here. Yeah, right there. So if you go in your settings for your project, you'll see that this is the Heroku Git URL for your project. You just set that up as a remote on Git. So you would just type in, and you need to download the Heroku command line tool too. So that's another thing you need to download if you don't already have it, the Heroku command line tool. And I will let you read the Heroku documentation on their website to figure that out. It's basically you just type in, you install it, then you type in Heroku login. It'll have you log into Heroku, and then it's working. But basically what you want to do is you want to add that Git repository to your project. So you would type in git remote, meaning you're going to add a remote URL, remote add, and then you would paste that URL, and then that, or actually you have to give a name to so it would be git add Heroku, and then you put in the repository URL. But once you're logged into Heroku, so first you would type in Heroku login, you would log in. If you wanted to go see the logs to see what the problem with your code is, you just type in Heroku logs, it'll bring in the logs. So that's if you see that 500 server error, and then that will show you your logs so you can determine what the error is. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Now let's see here. So we connected to the database. We've deployed the PHP API. So in that case, your API should be up and running, other than maybe any troubleshooting your code to make sure that you're getting past those particular errors at this point. So then the next step would be to handle React. And I would, at this point, just think as far as your React project, which is going to be in a separate folder. Okay. Let me just see. Was there anything else I want to say about this? I think we've covered it all. Now this folder here, vendor, again, that's just where Composer puts its dependencies. I would put that in your .gitignore. Okay, you don't want that folder going up. Again, all you need for Heroku is the proc file and the Composer JSON in your root folder. And again, the proc file should look like this. So if you want to pause the screen, look at that. That's all good. At that point, you should have overcome everything regarding the PHP with those particular directions. Now for React, let's say in a separate folder, so you can use like create React app to create your React application. You'll have a folder like this. It's going to have its own separate Git repository, and it's going to have a package.json. Okay, and again, see the package.json lists all the different dependencies that come with the project. Okay, in there, yeah, that's all you need technically. Now I think you could just push this up to Heroku, and then Heroku will build out your React project and figure it out. But the way I would do it is like first build out your React project. So just build it locally. The only issue you'll run into is that when you start doing like put and delete requests to your API, you're going to run into what's called CORS, CrossOrigin resource, whatever. And basically it's something that's built in the browser. So if you use like Postman that takes your API, you should be fine. But the minute you start making API calls from the browser has a built-in security feature that prevents certain types of attacks, that prevents non-authorized URLs from making complicated. So you can make a simple GET request, but pretty much anything else, it's going to reject. So there's two ways you can solve this. There's ways to set your headers on your API to avoid getting that error. I have at this moment I've yet to successfully do that with Heroku. The other solution is in your code when you're calling the API is to use CORS anywhere. Okay, and I'll show you in our code where. So for example, when we make a GET request, the way CORS anywhere works is you're going to put the CORS anywhere URL first, and then you put your API URL and just make your request. It is significantly slower than if you were able to make your API request directly. So if you are able to figure out how to set up your headers to avoid the CORS problem, then your life will be easier, or at least you can use this for development, and then we can refactor it later on. I'll give you two possibilities. Okay, so that would be, but otherwise you would just basically create your React app like you would create any React app. So again, all your components and all that stuff's in the folder. This is not a video about how to develop in React. This is just about deployment. But when you're done developing your React app, what you can do is you can run a command that says npm run build. Okay, npm run build is going to run Webpack, which is built into the create React app environment, and has all the configurations all set up, so you don't have to do anything. You just have to type in npm run build. It's going to go through your source folder and do what it needs to do to create a production ready output, which will be put into this build folder. Okay, so theoretically you have two options. You could deploy this build folder separately, or what you could do is you could literally just copy the contents of this folder and then copy them into your root. Copy them into the root of your PHP file. Okay, so if you do that, so if you were to just copy this, not the build part, just everything inside of the build, and put them in your root of your PHP folder, then technically it would all be on the same, you could put it all in that one same Heroku project. Okay, and it'll actually work, and you wouldn't have to worry about CORS because it's all in the same URL. So theoretically, you could do that. There might be some tinkering around, but that's what you can do once you have the built-out folder. What I'm doing is I'm actually taking that build folder and deploying it to Netlify. Okay, Netlify is another host. So Heroku is great for when your website has a backend. So if I need to deploy the API or a full stack application, I'm going to use Heroku. But I always type in Netlify. Why? Okay, netlify.com. Netlify is front end only. It has, you can do some back end stuff if you learn how to use what's called a cloud function, but that's a whole other conversation for another day. Although really interesting and something worth learning. But basically, if you open up a Netlify account, and you scroll all the way to the bottom of your dashboard, there's this block here. And then you can take that build folder and literally just drag it into that, and it'll literally deploy it. And your website will be deployed, and you'll be able to see it in like literally a few seconds. Okay? And then, so I already done that, so it's right here. And if I wanted to update it, I just go to deploys. There's this folder right here. or the little block right there, and I can just, well, I can just drag and drop that build folder right again as I build it over and over again. And then that project's up. So theoretically, you have your front end here, and that's a great thing about modern architecture in the sense where you have your back end and your front end apps are separate. They're not intrinsically tied together. Your front end app is just using the API of your back end app to interact with it. They don't have to be deployed in the same folder or in the same server. They can be in some completely separate places, and actually more often than not, they are for security purposes. So that way, if someone attacks your front end server, they don't take out your back end app, or vice versa. So that's pretty much how that works. So hopefully you guys found this useful. If you're doing a PHP and React project, I do recommend learning how to use Laravel. So let me give you a tour of what a Laravel project looks like. Okay, so I got a lot of files. So let's go to PHP, and let's go to sites. This Laravel project here. And basically, when you spin up a Laravel project, which is like, spinning up a create React app, but you're using Composer, so you'd be like Composer, Laravel, whatever. Read the Laravel documentation; it tells you what command to put in. But it gives you a big folder like this, and it's just, you don't have to deal with a lot of stuff because it's all there for you. And you have a folder for routes, and like for example, here are my API routes, and they're pretty straightforward. Okay, actually, let me show you the other one because the other one is a little bit more built up. Routes, and you got some really nice features here. So for example, like here in this API route, see this route right here, route API resource. What that does, it actually creates all full CRUD routes. So I don't have to create a separate route for get and delete. It just generates them right there for me. It makes life really, really easy. I got all sorts of tools for migration. It's got built-in compatibility with React and Vue, so that way you can easily spin up your front end right in these folders. It'll configure it all for you, so that way you don't have to worry about building and moving folders around and all that stuff. It just makes life really nice and easy. And then, like, just so you can see example, here's a Composer JSON file for a Laravel project. It looks like a package JSON. It's literally the same concept. So I'll leave it at that. I'll see you guys later. Have a great day and enjoy.